The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 3, Continued, Cassette 9, Side 2. The prior of the Carmelite monastery at Medina, wishing to reform his relaxed monks, came to Teresa and asked for her rules of discipline. The prior was tall, but was accompanied by a youth so short and frail that Teresa, with the humor that brightened her austerities, exclaimed as they left, "Blessed be the Lord, for I have a friar and a half for the foundation of my new monastery." The diminutive friar, Juan de Yepes y Alvarez, was destined to be San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, the soul and glory of the discalced Carmelite monks. Teresa's difficulties were not ended. The provincial of the Carmelites, perhaps to test her rule and courage, appointed her prioress of the Incarnation convent. The nuns there hated her, and feared that now, in revenge, she would subject them to every humiliation. But she behaved with such modesty and kindness that one by one they were won over, and gradually the new and stricter regimen replaced the old laxity. From this victory, Teresa advanced to found a new cloister in Seville. The friars of the mitigated rule resolved to stop the extension of the reform. Some of them smuggled an agent, as a discalced nun, into the Seville convent. Soon this woman proclaimed to Spain that Teresa flogged her nuns and heard confessions as if she were a priest. The Inquisition was again called upon to investigate her. She was summoned before the fearful tribunal. It heard her testimony and gave its verdict. "You are acquitted of all charges. Go and continue your work." But a papal nuncio was won over to her enemies. He denounced Teresa as a disobedient, contumacious woman who promulgates pernicious doctrines under the pretense of devotion, who left her cloister against the orders of her superiors, who is ambitious, and teaches theology as though she were a doctor of the Church, in contempt of St. Paul, who forbade women to teach. He commanded her to retire to confinement in a nunnery at Toledo, this in 1575. Hardly knowing where to turn in this new vicissitude, Teresa wrote to the king. Philip II had read and loved her Life. He sent a special courier to invite her to an audience. He heard it and was convinced of her saintliness. The nuncio, royally reproved, withdrew his order of restraint on Teresa and announced that he had been misinformed. Amid her travels and tribulations, she wrote famous manuals of mystical devotion. El Camino de la Perfección, The Way of Perfection, 1567, and El Castillo Interior, The Interior Castle, 1577. In the latter she revealed the return of her physical ailments. "It seems as though many swollen rivers were rushing within my brain over a precipice, and then again, drowned by the noise of the water, are voices of birds singing and whistling. I weary my brain and increase my headaches." Heart attacks recurred, and her stomach found it hard to retain food. Even so, she passed painfully from one to another of the many nunneries she had founded, examining, improving, inspiring. At Malaga she was seized with a paralytic fit. She recovered, went on to Toledo, and had another seizure. She recovered, went on to Segovia, Valladolid, Palencia, Burgos, Alva. There, a hemorrhage of the lungs forced her to stop. She accepted death cheerfully, confident that she was leaving a world of pain and evil for the everlasting companionship of Christ. After a shameful competition and successive kidnappings of her corpse by Alva and Avila, she was buried in the town of her birth. Pious worshippers claimed that her body never decayed, and many miracles were reported at her tomb. In 1593, the Order of Discalced Carmelites received papal sanction. Famous Spaniards like Cervantes and Lope de Vega joined in an appeal to the Pope to at least beatify her. It was done in 1614, and 8 years later Teresa was pronounced, along with the Apostle James, one of the two patron saints of Spain. Meanwhile, a greater than Teresa had come out of Spain to reform the Church and move the world. 4. Ignatius Loyola. Don Íñigo de Oñez y Loyola was born in the castle of Loyola in the Basque province of Guipúzcoa in 1491. He was one of 8 sons and 5 daughters begotten by Don Beltrán de Oñez y Loyola, a member of the higher Spanish nobility. Brought up to be a soldier, Íñigo received little schooling and showed no interest in religion. His reading was confined to Amadis of Gaul, and like romances of chivalry. At 7, he was sent to serve as a page to Don Juan Velázquez de Cuellar, through whom he had some access to the royal court. At 14, he fell in love with Ferdinand the Catholic's new queen, Germaine de Foix, and when in due course he was knighted, he chose her as his Queen of Hearts, wore her colors, and dreamed of winning a lace handkerchief from her hand as prize in a tournament. This did not prevent him from engaging in the casual amours and brawls that were half a soldier's life. In the simple and honest autobiography that he dictated in 1553-56, he made no effort to conceal these natural escapades. His carefree youth came to an end when he was assigned to active military service at Pamplona, capital of Navarre. 4 years he spent there, dreaming of glory and waking to routine. A chance came to distinguish himself. The French attacked Pamplona. Íñigo heartened the defense with his bravery. The enemy captured the citadel nevertheless, and Íñigo's right leg was fractured by a cannonball on May 20th, 1521. The victors treated him kindly, set his bones, and sent him on a stretcher to his ancestral castle. But the bones had been wrongly set. They had to be rebroken and reset. The second operation proved more incompetent than the first, for a stump of bone stuck out from the leg. A third operation set the bones straight, but the leg was now too short, and for weeks Íñigo bore the torture of an orthopedic stretcher that kept him helpless and weak and in constant pain. During the weary months of convalescence he asked for books, preferably for some exciting tale of knighthood and imperiled princesses. But the castle library was composed of 2 books only, Ludolphus's Life of Christ and Flos Sanctorum, recounting the lives of the saints. At first the soldier was bored by these volumes. Then the figures of Christ and Mary grew upon him, and the legends of the saints proved as wonderful as the epics of courtly love and war. These cavaliers of Christ were every bit as heroic as the caballeros of Castile. Gradually the thought formed in his mind that the noblest war of all was that of Christianity against Islam. In him, as in Dominic, the intensity of Spanish faith made religion no quiet devotion, as in Thomas à Kempis, but a passion of conflict, a holy war. He resolved to go to Jerusalem and free the sacred places from infidel control. One night he had a vision of the Virgin and her child. Thereafter, he later told Father González, no temptation to concupiscence ever assailed him. He rose from his bed, knelt, and vowed to be a soldier of Christ and Mary till his death. He had read that the Holy Grail had once been hidden in a castle at Montserrat in the province of Barcelona. There, said the most famous of all romances, Amadis had kept a full night's vigil before an image of the Virgin to prepare himself for knighthood. As soon as Íñigo could travel, he mounted a mule and set out for the distant shrine. For a while he still thought of himself as a soldier accoutered for physical combat. But the saints he had read about had had no weapons, no armor, only the poorest clothes and the firmest faith. Arrived in Montserrat, he cleansed his soul with 3 days of confession and penance. He gave his costly raiment to a beggar, and donned a pilgrim's robe of coarse cloth. All the night of March 24th to 25th, 1522, he spent alone in the chapel of a Benedictine monastery, kneeling or standing before the altar of the Mother of God. He pledged himself to perpetual chastity and poverty. The next morning he received the Eucharist, gave his mule to the monks, and set out on limping foot for Jerusalem. The nearest port was Barcelona. On the way he stopped at the hamlet of Manresa. An old woman directed him to a cave for shelter. For some days he made this his home, and there, eager to surpass the saints in asceticism, he practiced austerities that brought him close to death. Repenting the proud care that he had once taken of his appearance, he ceased to cleanse, cut, or comb his hair, which soon fell out. He would not trim his nails or bathe his body or wash his hands or face or feet. He lived on such food as he could beg, but never meat. He fasted for days at a time. He scourged himself thrice daily, and each day spent hours in prayer. A pious woman, fearful that his austerities would kill him, had him taken to her home, where she nursed him back to health. But when he was removed to a cell in a Dominican monastery at Manresa, he resumed his self-flagellation. His remembrance of past sins terrified him. He waged war against his body as the agent of his sins. He was resolved to beat all thought of sin out of his flesh. At times the struggle seemed hopeless, and he thought of suicide. Then visions came and strengthened him. At communion he believed that he saw not a wafer of bread, but the living Christ. At another time Christ and his mother appeared to him. Once he saw the Trinity, and understood by a flash of insight, beyond words or reason, the mystery of three persons in one God. And at another time, he tells us, God permitted him to understand how he had created the world. These visions healed the spiritual conflict that had produced them. He put behind him all worry about his youthful follies, he relaxed his asceticism, and having conquered his body, he could now cleanse it without vanity. From the experience of this struggle, almost a year long, he designed the spiritual exercises by which the heathen flesh could be subdued to the Christian will. Now he might present himself before the sacred shrines at Jerusalem. He set sail from Barcelona in February 1523. En route he stayed 2 weeks in Rome, escaping before its pagan spirit could bend him from sanctity. On July 14th he took ship from Venice for Jaffa. He suffered a host of calamities before reaching Palestine, but his continuing visions sustained him. Jerusalem itself was a tribulation. The Turks who controlled it allowed Christian visitors, but no proselytizing. And when Inigo proposed to convert the Muslims nevertheless, the Franciscan provincial who had been charged by the Pope to keep the peace bade the saint return to Europe. In March 1524 he was back in Barcelona. Perhaps he felt now that, though he was master of his body, he was subject to his imaginations. He determined to chasten his mind with education. Though now 33, he joined schoolboys in studying Latin. But the itch to teach is stronger than the will to learn. Soon Ignatius, as he was scholastically called, began to preach to a circle of pious but charming women. Their lovers denounced him as a spoil-sport and beat him brutally. He moved to Alcalá in 1526 and took up philosophy and theology. Here, too, he taught a little private group, chiefly of poor women, some of them prostitutes, hungering for redemption. He tried to exorcise their sinful propensities by spiritual exercises, but some of his pupils fell into fits or trances, and the Inquisition summoned him. He was imprisoned for 2 months, but he finally convinced the inquisitors of his orthodoxy and was released. However, he was forbidden to teach. He passed on to Salamanca in 1527 and went through a similar sequence of teaching, trial before the Inquisition, imprisonment, acquittal, and prohibition of further teaching. Disappointed with Spain, he set out for Paris, always on foot and in pilgrim garb, but now driving before him a donkey loaded with books. At Paris he lived in the poorhouse and begged in the streets for his food and tuition. He entered the Collège de Montaigu, where his sallow, haggard face, starved body, unkempt beard, and aged clothing made him a cynosure of unsympathetic eyes. But he pursued his purposes with such absorbed intensity that some students began to reverence him as a saint. Under his lead they engaged in spiritual exercises of prayer, penance, and contemplation. In 1529 he transferred to the Collège Sainte-Barbe, and there too he gathered disciples. His 2 roommates came by different routes to believe in his sanctity. Pierre Favre, or Peter Faber, as a shepherd in the Savoyard Alps, had suffered deeply from fears, superstitious or real, and under their influence he had vowed perpetual chastity. Now, aged 20, he concealed under his disciplined manners a soul struggling feverishly against temptations of the flesh. Ignatius, though making no pretensions to intellect, had the power of sensing the interior life of others through the intensity of his own. He surmised the problem of his younger friend and assured him that the impulses of the body could be controlled by a trained will. How train the will? By spiritual exercises, answered Ignatius. Together they practiced them. The other roommate, Francis Xavier, came from Pamplona, where Loyola had soldiered. He had a long line of distinguished ancestors. He was handsome, rich, proud, a gay blade who knew the taverns of Paris and their girls. He laughed at the 2 ascetics and boasted of his successes with women. Yet he was clever in his studies. He already had the master's degree and was aiming at a doctorate. One day he saw a man whose face was pocked with syphilis. It gave him pause. Once, when he was expounding his ambition to shine in the world, Ignatius quietly quoted the gospel to him. "What is a man profited if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Xavier resented the query, but he could not forget it. He began to join Loyola and Faber in their spiritual exercises. Perhaps his pride stirred him to equal the other 2 in power to bear deprivation, cold, and pain. They scourged themselves, fasted, slept in thin shirts on the floor of an unheated room. They stood barefoot and almost naked in the snow to harden and yet subdue their bodies. The spiritual exercises that had first taken shape at Manresa now reached a more definite form. Ignatius modeled them on the Ejercitatorio de la Vida Espiritual from 1500 of Don Garcia de Cisneros, Benedictine abbot at Montserrat. But he poured into that mold a fervor of feeling and imagination that made his little book a moving force in modern history. Loyola took as his starting point the infallibility of the Bible and the Church. Individual judgment in religion, he held, was the vain and chaos-breeding pretense of proud, weak minds. We ought always be ready to believe that what seems to us white is black, if the hierarchical Church so defines it. To avoid damnation, we must train ourselves to be unquestioning servants of God, and of God's vicar on earth, the Church. As the first spiritual exercise, we should recall our many sins and consider how much punishment they deserve. Lucifer was condemned to hell for one sin, and is not our every sin a like rebellion against God? Let us keep a daily count of our sins by marks on lines that represent the days, and let us strive each day to reduce the marks. Kneeling in our darkened room or cell, let us picture hell to ourselves as vividly as we can. We must conjure up all the horrors of the undying fire. We must vision the torments of the damned, hear their shrieks of pain and their cries of despair. We must smell the stinking fumes of burning sulfur and flesh. We must try to feel those tongues of flame scorching our own bodies, and then we must ask ourselves, how can we escape that everlasting agony? Only through the redeeming sacrifice which God himself, as Christ, offered on the cross. Let us then contemplate the life of Christ, and in every detail. We must make ourselves present in imagination at those profoundest events in the history of the world. We must in fancy kneel before the holy figures in that divine epoch and kiss the hem of their garments. After 2 weeks of such meditations, we must accompany Christ through every step in his passion, every station of the cross. We must pray with him in Gethsemane, feel ourselves scourged with him, spat upon, nailed to the cross. We must suffer every moment of his agony, must die with him, lie with him in the tomb. And in the 4th week we must picture ourselves rising triumphantly from the grave, rising at last with him into heaven. Strengthened by that blessed vision, we shall be ready to join as dedicated soldiers in the battle to defeat Satan and win men to Christ. And in that holy war, we shall gladly bear every hardship and joyfully spend our lives. This call to lifelong devotion found 9 students at Paris ready to accept it. Earnest young men, feeling for the first time the unintelligibility of the world, and longing for some anchor of belief and hope in a sea of doubts and fears, may have been moved by the very extent of the demands made upon them, to put their fate, their lives, and salvation in Loyola's plan. He proposed that in due time they should go together to Palestine and live there a life as nearly as possible like Christ's. On August 15th, 1534, Loyola, Faber, Xavier, Diego Lainez, Alonso Salmeron, Nicolas Bobadilla, Simon Rodriguez, Claude Leger, Jean Couture, and Pachas Broet, in a little chapel in Montmartre, took the vows of chastity and poverty and pledged themselves, after 2 years of further study, to go and live in the Holy Land. They had as yet no apparent notion of combating Protestantism. Islam seemed to them the greater challenge. They had no interest in theological disputes. Their aim was sanctity. Their movement was rooted in Spanish mysticism rather than in the intellectual conflicts of the time. The best argument would be a holy life. In the winter of 1536-37, they walked through France, over the Alps, and across Italy to Venice, where they hoped to find passage to Jaffa. But Venice was at war with the Turks. The trip was impossible. During the delay, Ignatius met Carafa, and for a time joined the Theatines. His experience with these devoted priests had some influence in changing his plan from life in Palestine to service of the Church in Europe. He and his disciples agreed that if, after a year of waiting, Palestine should still be closed to them, they would offer themselves to the Pope for any service that he might assign to them. Faber secured permission for all of them to be ordained priests. By this time, Loyola was 46. He was bald and still limped slightly from his wound. His 5 feet and 2 inches would have left him quite unimpressive had it not been for an aristocratic refinement of features, the sharp nose and chin, the somber, deep-set, piercing black eyes, the grave, intent countenance. He was already the absorbed and almost humorless saint. He was no persecutor. Though he approved of the Inquisition, he was rather its victim than its agent. He was stern but kind. He willingly served the sick in hospitals and plague. His dream was to win converts not by the pyre or the sword, but by catching character and malleable youth and forming it immovably to faith. Founder of the most successful educational order in history, he laid little emphasis on learning or intellect. He was not a theologian, took no part in the arguments and refinements of the scholastics. He preferred direct perception to rational understanding. He did not have to argue about the existence of God, of Mary and the saints. He was convinced that he had seen them. He had felt them closer to him than any object or person in his surroundings. In his own way, he was a God-intoxicated man. Yet his mystical experiences did not make him impractical. He could combine pliancy of means with inflexibility of ends. He would not justify any means for an end that he held good, but he could bide his time, moderate his hopes and demands, adjust his methods to characters and conditions, use diplomacy where needed, judge men shrewdly, choose fit aids and agents, and manage men as if he were, as he actually thought himself, a general leading a martial company. He called his little band by a military term, Compañía de Jesús. They were soldiers enlisted for life in the war against unbelief and the dissolution of the Church. For their part, as a matter of course and necessity, they accepted the military discipline of coordinated action under absolute command. In the fall of 1537, Loyola, Faber, and Linnaeus set out from Venice to Rome to ask papal approval of their plans. They walked all the way, begged their food, and lived mostly on bread and water. But they sang psalms happily as they went along, as if they knew that out of their small number would grow a powerful and brilliant organization. 5. The Jesuits. Arrived in Rome, they did not at once ask audience with the Pope, for Paul III was immersed in critical diplomacy. They took service in the Spanish hospital, tended the sick, taught the young. Early in 1538, Paul received them, and was impressed by their desire to go to Palestine and live there as exemplary monks. He and some cardinals contributed 210 crowns, or about $5,250, to pay the passage of the band. When the devotees had to abandon the idea as impracticable, they returned the money to the donors. Those members who had remained in the north were summoned to Rome, and the company now numbered 11. Paul appointed Faber and Linnaeus to professorships in the Sapienza, the University of Rome, while Ignatius and the rest devoted themselves to works of charity and education. Loyola made a special mission of converting prostitutes. With funds collected from his supporters, he founded the House of Martha to receive such women, and his fervent preaching against sexual transgressions made him many enemies in Rome. As new candidates were received into the company, it became desirable to define its principles and rule. The vow of obedience was added to those of chastity and poverty. The general chosen by them was to be obeyed only next to the Pope. A fourth vow was taken, to serve the Roman pontiff as God's vicar on earth, and to execute immediately and without hesitation or excuse all that the reigning pope or his successors may enjoin upon them for the benefit of souls or for the propagation of the faith, anywhere in the world. In 1539, Loyola asked Cardinal Contarini to submit these articles of organization to Paul III and to request the papal confirmation of the company as a new order. The Pope was favorable. Some cardinals dissented, thinking the group to be unmanageable extremists, but Paul overcame their objections, and by the bull Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, for the rule of the Church militant, he formally established what the bull called Societas Jesu, the Society of Jesus, on September 27, 1540. The members were properly called clerks regular of the Society of Jesus. The name Jesuit did not appear till 1544, and then chiefly as a satirical term used by Calvin and other critics. It was never used by Ignatius himself. After his death, the success of the new order deprived the term of its early sting, and in the 16th century it was a badge of honor. On April 17, 1541, Ignatius was elected general. For several days thereafter he washed his dishes and discharged the humblest offices. During his remaining years, he was now 50, he made Rome his home, and the city became the permanent headquarters of the society. Between 1547 and 1552, after much thought and experiment, he drew up the constitutions which, with minor changes, are the Jesuit rule today. The ultimate authority in the order was to lie in the fully professed members. These would choose 2 delegates from each province, and these delegates, together with the provincial heads, the general and his aides, were to compose the general congregation. This would, when occasion required, elect a new general, and then it would delegate its authority to him as long as he should commit no grave offense. He was given an admonitor and 4 assistants who were to watch his every act, warn him of any serious fault, and, if need appeared, convene the general congregation to depose him. Candidates for admission were required to pass through 2 years of novitiate. in which they would be trained in the purpose and discipline of the society, go through the spiritual exercises, perform menial duties, and submit to the superiors in absolute holy obedience. They must put aside their own individual wills and allow themselves to be ordered like soldiers and moved about like corpses. They must learn to feel that in obeying their superiors they are obeying God. They must agree to report the faults of their associates to their superiors, and to harbor no resentment against being reported themselves. This discipline was rigorous but discriminating and flexible. Rarely did it break the will or destroy initiative. Apparently the willingness to obey is the first step in learning to command, for this training produced a great number of able and enterprising men. Those who survived this trying novitiate would take simple, revocable, vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and would enter the second class. Some of these would remain in that status as lay brothers. Some, as formed scholastics, aspiring to the priesthood, would study mathematics, the classics, philosophy, and theology, and would teach in schools and colleges. Those who passed further tests would enter the third class, formed coadjutors, and some of these might rise into the fourth class, the professed, all priests, and specially pledged to undertake any task or mission assigned them by the Pope. The professed were usually a small minority, sometimes hardly more than a tenth of the entire society. All four classes were to live in common like monks, but in view of their many administrative and pedagogical duties they were exempted from the monastic obligation to recite the canonical hours. No ascetic practices were required, though they might on occasion be advised. There was to be moderation in eating and drinking, but no stringent fasting. Body as well as mind was to be kept fit for all tasks. A member might retain title to such property as he owned when entering the order, but all income from it was to go to the society, which hoped to be the ultimate heir. Every Jesuit possession and action must be dedicated ad majorem Dei gloriam, to the greater glory of God. Seldom has an institution borne so definitely the stamp of one personality. Loyola lived long enough to revise the constitutions into a successfully functioning rule. From his small, bare room he guided with severe authority and great skill the movements of his little army in every quarter of Europe and many other parts of the globe. The task of governing the society, and of establishing and administering 2 colleges and several charitable foundations in Rome, proved too much for his temper as he aged, and though kind to the weak, he became cruelly harsh to his closest subordinates. He was severest on himself. He made many a meal from a handful of nuts, a piece of bread, and a cup of water. Often he left but 4 hours of the day for sleep, and even restricted to a daily half-hour the period that he allowed himself for celestial visions and illumination. When he died in 1556, many Romans felt that a sharp wind had ceased to blow, and perhaps some of his followers mingled relief with grief. Men could not realize so soon that this indomitable Spaniard would prove to be one of the most influential men in modern history. At his death, the society had approximately 1,000 members, of whom some 35 were professed. After disputes that showed considerable will to power in Jesuits supposedly broken in will, Diego Lainez was chosen general in 1558. The fact that he had Jewish ancestors 4 generations back made him unacceptable to some Spanish grandees who had some influence in the order. Pope Paul IV, fearful that the office of Jesuit general, because of its life tenure, might grow to rival the papacy, ordered the constitutions revised to limit the general's term to 3 years. But Pius IV revoked the order, and the general became, as later generations would call him from his black cassock, the Black Pope. After Francis Borgia, Duke of Gandia, joined the order and dowered it with his wealth, the society grew rapidly in size and power. When he became its 3rd general in 1565, it had 3,500 members, living in 130 houses in 18 provinces or countries. Europe was but a small sector of its activities. It sent missionaries to India, China, Japan, and the New World. In North America, they were venturesome and undiscourageable explorers, suffering every tribulation as a gift of God. In South America, they did more than any other group to develop education and scientific agriculture. In 1541, St. Francis Xavier left Lisbon on a Portuguese vessel, and after a year of travel and travail reached Goa. There he walked up and down the streets, ringing a handbell to gather an audience. This accomplished, he expounded the Christian creed with such sincerity and eloquence, and illustrated the Christian ethic with such cheerful sharing of his poorest listener's life, that he made thousands of converts among Hindus and Moslems, and even convinced some hardship-hardened expatriated Portuguese Christians. His cures were probably caused by his contagious confidence or his incidental knowledge of medicine. Miracles were later ascribed to him, but he himself claimed none. The papal bull that canonized him in 1622 credited him with the gift of tongues, the ability to speak any language at need. But in truth, the heroic saint was a poor linguist who spent hours memorizing sermons in Tamil, Malay, or Japanese. Sometimes his faith was too strong for his humanity. He urged John III of Portugal to establish the Inquisition in Goa, and recommended that no Hindu should be ordained unless he had several generations of Christian ancestors. He could not bear the thought of a Portuguese confessing to a native. He finally left Goa as too polyglot for his purposes. "I want to be where there are no Muslims or Jews. Give me out-and-out pagans." These, he felt, were more open to conversion, as being less ingrained in another faith. In 1549 he set out for Japan, studying Japanese on the way. Landing at Kagoshima, he and his associates preached in the streets and were courteously heard by the people. 2 years later he returned to Goa. He settled some disorder that had arisen among the Christians there, and then sailed off to convert China in 1552. After much suffering, he stopped on the island of Changchuen, below the mouth of the Canton River. The Chinese emperor had made it a capital crime for a European to enter China, yet Xavier would have dared it had he been able to find passage. While he waited, he fell sick. He died on December 2, 1552, crying, "In thee, O Lord, have I hoped. Let me not be confounded forever." He was 46 years old. The same devotion which the Jesuits showed in foreign missions was displayed in their work in Europe. They kept to their posts and tended the sick in times of plague. They preached to all classes and accommodated their language to every situation. Their superior education and good manners made them the favorite confessors of women and nobles, finally of kings. They mingled actively in the affairs of the world, but with prudence and tact. Ignatius advised them that more prudence and less piety were better than more piety and less prudence. Usually they were men of high moral quality. The faults charged against them in a later period hardly appeared in this age. Though they corporately approved of the Inquisition, they stood aside from it, preferring to work through education. Their limited number compelled them to leave to others the instruction of children. They concentrated on secondary education, and finding the universities preempted by other orders, or the secular or Protestant clergy, they organized their own colleges and sought to train selected youths who would be centers of influence in the next generation. They became the greatest educators of their time. At important points in Europe they established studia inferiora, corresponding to the German Gymnasien and the French lycée, and studia superiora, colleges. Sometimes, as at Coimbra and Louvain, they were able to take over existing universities. They shocked their competitors by giving instruction gratis. The curriculum probably owed something to the schools set up in Holland and Germany by the Brethren of the Common Life, something to the Gymnasium of Sturm at Strasbourg, something to the humanist academies of Germany and Italy. It was based on the classics and was given in Latin. The use of the vernacular was forbidden to the students except on holidays. In the higher grades, the scholastic philosophy was restored. The education of character, of morals and manners, was given fresh emphasis and was bound up anew with religious belief. The traditional faith was inculcated daily, and a regimen of prayer, meditation, confession, communion, mass, and theology so imbued the students with orthodoxy that few of them in the 16th century ever strayed from that beaten path. Humanism was turned back from paganism to Christianity. The system had serious defects. It relied too much on memory, and it discouraged originality. Like the other curricula of the time, it was deficient in the sciences, and expurgated history to control the present. And yet so independent a thinker as Francis Bacon would soon say of the Jesuit schools, "Such as they are, would that they were ours." In the next 2 centuries, their graduates would excel in almost every walk of life, except scientific research. By the time of Loyola's death, there were 100 Jesuit colleges. Through education, diplomacy, and devotion, through fervor directed by discipline, through coordination of purposes and skillful variation of means, the Jesuits turned back the Protestant tide and recaptured much of Germany, most of Hungary and Bohemia, all of Christian Poland, for the Church. Rarely has so small a group achieved so much so rapidly. Year by year its prestige and influence grew until, within 20 years of its formal establishment, it was recognized as the most brilliant product of the Catholic reform. When at last the Church dared to call that general council to which all Europe had so long looked for the quieting of its theological strife and the healing of its religious wounds, it was to a handful of Jesuits, to their learning, loyalty, discretion, resourcefulness, and eloquence, that the popes entrusted the defense of their own challenged authority and the undiminished preservation of the ancient faith. Chapter 39, the last chapter, the Popes and the Council, 1517 to 1565. 1. The Popes at Bay. We have left to the last the difficult task, for a non-Catholic, of understanding and impartially describing the reaction of the popes to the challenge of the Reformation. It was at first a reaction of pained surprise. The popes of the Reformation period, with perhaps one exception, were good men, so far as statesmen are permitted so to be, not selfless or sinless, but basically decent, humane, and intelligent, and sincerely convinced that the Church was an institution not only magnificent in its achievements, but still indispensable to the moral health and mental peace of European man. Granting that the human ministrants of the Church had fallen into serious abuses, were there not equivalent or worse defects in every secular administration? And if one should hesitate to overthrow civil government because of the greed of princes and the peculations of officials, should one hesitate any less to subvert a Church that had been for 1,000 years, through religion, education, literature, philosophy, and art, the nourishing mother of European civilization? What if some dogmas that had been found helpful in promoting morality and order seemed difficult of digestion by the historian or the philosopher? Were the doctrines proposed by the Protestants so much more rational or credible as to warrant turning Europe upside down over the difference? In any case, religious doctrines were determined not by the logic of a few, but by the needs of many. They were a frame of belief within which the common man, inclined by nature to 100 unsocial actions, could be formed into a being sufficiently disciplined and self-controlled to make society and civilization possible. Let that frame be shattered, and another would have to be built, perhaps after centuries of moral and psychical disorder. For were not the Reformers agreed with the Church that a moral code would be ineffective unless supported by religious belief? As to the intellectual classes, were they any freer or happier under Protestant princes than under Catholic popes? Had not art flowered under the leadership of the Church, and was it not withering under the hostility of reformers who wished to take from the people the images that fed the poetry and hope of their lives? What commanding reasons were there, to mature minds, for atomizing Christendom into countless sects, each vilifying and nullifying the others, and individually powerless against the instincts of men? We cannot know that these were the sentiments of the Reformation popes, for the active leaders of men seldom publish their philosophies. But we may so imagine the mood of Leo X, 1513 to 1521, who found the papacy rocking under his feet so soon after he had been called to enjoy it. He was a man like many of us, guilty of sin and criminal negligence, but all in all forgivable. He was usually the kindest of men, feeding half the poets of Rome. Yet he pursued the heretics of Brescia to the death, and tried to believe that disruptive ideas could be roasted out of mankind. He was as patient with Luther as could have been asked of a pope and a Medici. Imagine the tables turned, and how Pope Martin would have blasted rebellious Leo from the earth. Leo mistook the Reformation as an unmannerly dispute among unsophisticated monks. And yet, early in 1517, at the very outset of his pontificate, Gianfrancesco Pico della Mirandola, nephew of the more famous Pico, had delivered before the Pope and the cardinals a remarkable address, painting in the darkest manner the corruption which had made its way into the Church, and predicting that if Leo refuses to heal the wounds, it is to be feared that God himself will no longer apply a slow remedy, but will cut off and destroy the diseased members with fire and sword. Despite this warning, Leo absorbed himself in maintaining, for the protection of the Papal States, a balance of power between France and the Empire. He never gave a thought, says a Catholic historian, to reform on the grand scale which had become necessary. The Roman Curia remained as worldly as ever. The best proof that reform could come only by a blow from without was the failure of Adrian VI, 1522 to 1523. Candidly admitting the abuses and undertaking to reform them at the top, Adrian was ridiculed and reviled by the Romans as threatening their supply of transalpine gold. And after 2 years of contending against this unenlightened selfishness, Adrian died of frustration. The accumulated storm burst upon the head of Clement VII, 1523 to 1534. Intellectually and morally, he was among the best popes, humane and generous, defending the hounded Jews, taking no part in the sexual or financial looseness that surrounded him, and continuing to the end of his troubled life to nourish with discriminating patronage the art and literature of Italy. Perhaps he was too well educated to be a successful administrator. His intellect was keen enough to see good reasons for every course and every crisis. His knowledge sapped his courage, and his vacillations alienated power after power. We cannot withhold all sympathy from a man so well-intentioned, who saw Rome sacked under his eyes and himself imprisoned by a mob and an emperor, who was prevented by that emperor from seeking a reasonable peace with Henry VIII, who had to make the bitter choice between losing Henry and England or Charles and Germany, who, when he protested against the alliance of Francis with the Turks, was told by that most Christian king that if the Pope protested further, France would divorce itself from the papacy. Never had a pope drunk the cup of office to such bitter dregs. His errors were catastrophic. When he miscalculated the character and resources of Charles and so invited the sack of Rome, he dealt the prestige of the papacy a blow that emboldened northern Germany to renounce allegiance to Rome. When he crowned the man who had permitted that attack, he lost the respect of even the Catholic world. He yielded to Charles partly through lack of material power to resist, partly because he feared that an alienated emperor would call a general council of laity as well as clergy, would seize the reins of both ecclesiastical and secular authority, would complete the subjection of the Church to the rampant state, might even depose him as a bastard. If he had had the courage that his uncle Lorenzo de' Medici had shown at Naples in 1479, Clement would have taken the initiative and would have called a council that under his liberal leadership might have reformed the morals and doctrine of the Church and saved the unity of Western Christendom. His successor seemed at first sight to have all the requisites of both intellect and character. Born in a rich and cultured family, instructed in the classics by Pomponius Letus, maturing as a humanist among the Medici in Florence, favored by a pope whom his sister had entangled in her golden hair, made a cardinal at 25 in 1493, proving his mettle in difficult diplomatic assignments, rising to unquestioned preeminence in the College of Cardinals, and unanimously elected pope in 1534, Alessandro Farnese, as Paul III, was universally recognized as the right man for the highest office in the Christian world. The esteem in which he was held suffered little from his having begotten 4 children before his ordination as a priest in 1519. Yet his character, like his career, showed uncertainty and contradictions, partly because he stood like a shaken pillar between the Renaissance that he loved and a Reformation that he could not understand or forgive. Frail in body, he survived 15 years of political and domestic storms. Equipped with all the learning of his time, he regularly resorted to astrologers to determine the most favorable hour for a journey, a decision, even an audience. A man of strong feeling and given now and then to bursts of anger, he was noted for his self-control. Cellini, whom he had to imprison, described him as one who had no faith in God or aught beside. This seems extreme, and certainly Paul had faith in himself until, in his final years, the behavior of his progeny weakened his will to live. He was punished where he had sinned. He restored the nepotism that had marked the Renaissance papacy, gave Piacenza and Parma to his son Pierluigi and Camerino to his grandson Ottavio, bestowed the red hat on his nephews, 14 and 17 years old, and promoted them despite their notorious immorality. He had character without morals and intellect without wisdom. He recognized the justice of the criticisms directed by the reformers at the administration of the Church, and if ecclesiastical amendment had been the only obstacle to reconciliation, he might have ended the Reformation. This book is continued on Cassette 10, Side 1.